Hello and welcome to Washington, D.C. We are on the National Mall and we're going to take a little walking tour of some historic survey marks that are here on the mall. We're being supported by the National Society of Professional Surveyors, NSPS. We are deeply grateful to the National Park Service, whose territory, whose land we are on right now. In fact, we are standing in front of what's known as Survey Lodge for the Park Service. They don't have surveyors there anymore, but it's an old historic site. And so we're going to take a few minutes during this course to walk up across the mall and, as I said, visit a number of historic survey marks, many of which surveyors, unless you happen to be here and working with organizations like perhaps the National Geodetic Survey, some of these marks you may never see. That being said, all of the marks that we're going to be visiting in this little trip are published as part of the National Spatial Reference System by the National Geodetic Survey. And the data for them, their coordinates, state plane coordinates, latitude and longitude, heights, all of that information can be found on the NGS website at ngs.noaa, that's NOAA.gov. So all of these data are part of that and participate as part of the horizontal and vertical datums of the United States. So let's go take a look at the first mark. So here we are at the first mark on our little journey. There's a number of issues that are unique about this, or relatively unique. First, the disc itself, inscribed around the edge of the disc, says public buildings and public parks. Now, that organization, that institution, does not exist anymore. It was created back in the 1870s as part of the U.S. Engineering Department, which we now commonly refer to as the Corps of Engineers. So this was a Corps of Engineer office that had responsibilities for surveying and mapping a huge range of the federal activities in and around the federal city, Washington, D.C. You will only find these marks in the District of Columbia and a few over in Northern Virginia and a couple up in Southern Maryland that are very close to the city. So they were placed by the Army Engineers. It was later observed and became part of what we now call the NGS database by the then U.S. Coast and Geodetic Survey. The mark itself is designated, that is, it's stamped on the top, M17. So if you go looking for this mark in the NGS database, all you have to do is type in M17 for District of Columbia and the data sheet for this mark will pop right up. It's a nice beginning place for a number of the surveys that have been conducted around here, simply because it's very high order vertical accuracy. This whole area that we are standing in, the Washington Mall, the National Mall, is actually, most of this is fill. Right? When it was created, this was to a great extent where the Potomac River was. So this entire area is subject to modest but important subsidence. So these marks, that many of them that you'll see, form a great foundation for the capability of the city, the federal government, to monitor how the land is actually moving in and around this area. So it will, as the others will be, it will be included in the new datums that are coming live probably in the middle part of 2025, if not by 2026. So if you have an opportunity, you come here, you start at this mark, right? And we'll now start walking up the hill to the Washington Monument to visit a couple of fairly historic monuments that go back over 200 years. So here we are up in the grounds of the Washington Monument, and we are at what's referred to as benchmark A, the letter A, although commonly referenced as the mini monument, and I'll come back to that. Surveyors around the country can easily identify the fact that there are thousands of unique survey marks all across the country. In my opinion, This is one of the most unique marks that we have in the United States. So here we are on the grounds of the Washington Monument. A little history. The monument itself was originally designed under the direction of a foundation, a private foundation. They had some money, they started building it, but by roughly about the 1850s, they ran out of money. So you'll see a discoloration in the stone up there, and that's where they stopped building. And it sat like that, out in the open, not finished, for the better part of 20 years before Congress finally got together and said, nope, we've got to finish this monument. They allocated the funding to have it completed, and they gave that to what was then the Public Buildings and Public Parks, as I mentioned about the mark previously, now referred to as the Army Corps of Engineers. And to do that work, they selected a colonel, a civil engineer, Thomas Casey. And Casey had a long history of building stone forts along the coastline. So he was really used to working on extremely large structures on somewhat unstable ground. Now, of course, at the time, the Washington Monument had been completed, but Casey understood that once completed at 555 feet, 5.5 inches, that the monument would weigh approximately 45,000 tons. And this whole area that we're standing on is soft clay. So he knew that that was going to compress the earth quite a bit. So he was very, very cautious about beginning the effort until he had taken a good hard look at the foundation under the monument. Well, as it turned out, he determined fairly quickly that the foundation that had been originally defined, originally built, was not going to support 45,000 tons. So right away, he has to redesign the foundation. And in doing that, he understood that he needed at least one survey mark, and that's this one, from which he could daily determine height differences to ensure that the monument was not settling in an undue fashion. So he set this mark. Now, you'll see that when you look at it, you look down, it's identical to the Washington Monument. It looks just like the monument. It's 14 feet deep. It's got a little flat spot on the top, unlike the Washington Monument, which is a pinnacle. And that flat spot is so you could put a level rod on it. And from there, he would make vertical measurements, leveling measurements, over to the Washington Monument. Now, we'll go over there in a few minutes, and I'll show you some of those benchmarks. So this mark, 14 feet deep, it's teed at the bottom so that it doesn't have any uplift to it. And he used it during the entire construction of the Washington Monument, which was completed in the 1880s. After that point, it was covered over, and most people never see it. In fact, you have to kind of know the secret handshake with our good friends with the National Park Service to get access to the mark. So the overwhelming majority of surveyors in the country who might come through town visiting with their families or whatever would never get a chance to see this mark except in videos like this. Or if you go to the NGS website and you download control for this area, again, it's called A, just the letter A, you'll find the data sheet for this mark, and on that data sheet you can find digital images of what the mark actually looks like. So to me, it's one of the most historic marks that we have. It's been in continuous use since the 1870s, now a very significant part of the National Spatial Reference Frame for the city of Washington and the surrounding area. So what we're going to do now is we're going to take a little walk over to the monument, and we're going to talk about some of the history of the vertical control over there. Got some kind of unique marks to look at. Here we are, obviously, at the Washington Monument. We are at the southwest corner. Now, the monument has quite a long history of having vertical control performed here. The first notable control, other than the work that Thomas Casey did when he was building it, came in 1884 when the then U.S. Coast and Geodetic Survey, now the National Geodetic Survey, ran the first geodetic levels into the city of Washington from the area of the Chesapeake and Ohio Canal, which is just a couple of miles away. So they ran vertical control in here. They actually set a bolt at the southwest corner. Well, over the years, the Park Service has remodeled this entire walkway, and that mark was destroyed. It was later replaced by a standard, what most people would recognize as a standard Coast and Geodetic Survey benchmark disc, which was over at the front door. And then that got destroyed during some renovation. So since the National Geodetic Survey had the responsibility of leveling to the monument roughly every 10 years, we had to come up with a new idea for a way to have permanent benchmarks that were never going to be destroyed. And one of the guys at the National Geodetic Survey came up with what I think was an absolutely brilliant idea. And that is to create these very unique stainless steel benchmarks that are nowhere close to being noticeable like a standard disc would be, but they're really stainless steel. So this is a stainless steel plug, and we'll see here. It's got 2 holes in the top. That's the 2 holes that you see there. You need a special tool. If you're going to level here, you have to have this special tool or something very close to it, in which you simply unscrew the cap. I'll show you how to do this in a moment. You unscrew the cap. Yep. Give me a second. There we go. And then this pin is specifically tooled to fit in here. So that becomes the benchmark. So if I do this now, oh, and this mark is referred to as A, the letter A8, the number 8. So if you're looking in the NGS database, you just type in A8, the data for this will come up. There's a similar one to it on the northeast side of the monument. It's called B8. And there's your benchmark. So the surveyor simply places the rod on the mark, and now you have a place to start from. Again, there's another one identical to it on the northeast side of the monument. So every time the National Geodetic Survey comes down, again, about every 10 years, to perform leveling, to look at how the monument is settling, because it is settling, these 2 marks are primary. They were set in 1982. They worked so well that it took a while, but in 2011, when the agency did the last significant leveling of this whole area after a small earthquake down in Virginia caused a crack in the Washington Monument, NGS came in, performed a lot of leveling, and at that time, we put marks identical to this over in the Lincoln Memorial and in the Jefferson. So all the major monuments down here now have similar style marks that surveyors have access to. We are now going to take a short walk over to one of the most historic monuments, I think, in the entire United States. It was set under the direction of President Jefferson, and it's got a very unique history. So let's go take a little walk. It's not very far. So here we are at what I think is one of the most historic survey monuments in the entire United States. It has great history. We're still on the grounds of the Washington Monument, so I do want to take a second here to make a note that while previously, when we were up at the monument, I talked about running levels in. It's also really important to note that the very top of the Washington Monument, what's referred to as the pyramidium, right, is actually a survey mark itself. Right? In 1934, what was then the Coast and Geodetic Survey, in collaboration with the National Park Service, when there was some construction work going on here, actually went to the very top and performed triangulation measurements. Well, the Park Service was doing some later renovation in 1999. And we at the National Geodetic Survey, we heard about this and we said, what a golden opportunity to now do the same thing, but with contemporary global positioning system observations. So we made a deal with the National Park Service Very cooperative arrangement, and when their contractors were finished the work on top of the Washington Monument, National Geodetic Survey and a number of the manufacturers of high-end GPS tools back in 1999 all took a turn observing the very top for 24 hours. So there was wonderful contributions from the companies like Ashtec and Trimble and Leica, we had a wonderful time literally sitting on top of the Washington Monument for a week performing these incredible observations. So where we are now, this mark goes by pretty much two names, the Jefferson Stone or the Jefferson Pier. In the NGS database, it's referred to as the Jefferson Pier. Now, President Jefferson, as any good surveyor would know, President Jefferson himself was a very, very well-respected surveyor over in the state of Virginia. And obviously, one of the several surveyors that when surveyors do go to a place like Mount Rushmore, they see three surveyors and the other guy, right? So we had three presidents who were surveyors. Jefferson understood at the time that when he was in office, one of the things that he worked so hard to do and accomplished was to create a consistent set of nautical charts for the United States. So the overwhelming majority of the population lived near the shoreline. Almost all of our trade, our commerce, transportation, significant amounts of it over any distance, were by sea. And we had no consistent and accurate nautical charts. And one of the first things Jefferson did to rectify that was he intended to create a meridian of the United States. Now, in those days, let me back up. Today, everybody recognizes globally, universally, that the meridian, the prime meridian for longitude is Greenwich, England, the great observatory in Greenwich. At the time, the 1800s, the beginning of the 1800s, 1700s, every developed country had their own prime meridian. So if you were a British navigator, you used Greenwich. If you were a Spanish navigator, you used Madrid. The French had Paris. The Russians had Pukolvo. And Jefferson realized if we're going to have our own charts, we have to have our own meridian. So, being a surveyor, he understood that, and he contracted a local surveyor, Isaac Briggs, to come in and perform astronomical observations to create a zero meridian through the White House. Good idea. It had originally been thought of, previous to that, by Pierre L'Enfant. L'Enfant had considered that there should be a prime meridian, but it would go through the Capitol, which is just at the other end of the mall. That never happened. When Jefferson decided this, he dictated that the mark should be at the intersection of the meridian, the longitude, through the White House at this point, and the latitude through the dome of the Capitol. Well, Isaac Briggs set the mark here and performed the observations. The physical monument was set subsequent to that by a gentleman, Nicholas King, who was the city surveyor. Now, the original mark, the top of the mark, was destroyed after years of disuse, but the base is underneath. The top part that you see now was a replacement put in by the Army engineers in the 1890s, and it maintains that same meridian. When it was set and finally determined, and we actually able to compute the intersection of the longitude through the White House and the latitude through the Capitol, it's not quite at the pinnacle at this point. It's about 2.2 feet to the north towards the White House. So they didn't quite get it. Now, all of that being said, I think this is an exceptionally cool monument because there's an actual book written about one survey monument, which I think is very great. It's called the Jefferson Stone. It was written by Silvio Bedini, who was a great researcher at the Smithsonian Institute. So Silvio Bedini has a tremendous amount of history in here that I could never cover. And I would highly recommend, if you're at all interested in surveying history, particularly obviously the United States and certainly one, get a copy of the Jefferson Stone. You can find it on Amazon. It's quite reasonable. So, leaving this point, oh, and I should note that several of the monuments have been designed to be in this same meridian. So a little bit later, we're going to be walking up towards the White House, and you'll see two other marks. I hope we're going to find two other marks that are in the same meridian. And if I simply turn 180 degrees, and I'm now looking at the Jefferson, that same meridian passes through Jefferson's head, quite fittingly, I think. So why don't we go ahead and take a little stroll over to what's called President's Park, and we're going to look for another meridian stone. There's another story there. Here we are on the ellipse, again, another part of the National Park Service, and we are obviously just to the south of the Washington Monument. We're at another historic survey mark. It's referenced, it's inscribed, it's a pillar, but it's inscribed U.S. Meridian 1890. It was set by Public Buildings and Public Parks, the U.S. Army Engineers, now the Corps of Engineers, because the Jefferson Stone that we just left was constantly in order of disrepair. And the Army Engineers wanted to preserve that meridian. So they established this mark to do that, to preserve what was referenced as the meridian of the United States. And there's kind of a fun story about recovering this mark. So I was working at the National Geodetic Survey, and this is 1990, and I knew about this mark. I had seen descriptions of it in the NGS database, but I'd never been here. Well, we got involved in a project that was around the DC area, and so I thought, well, what a great time to maybe go look for it, because even though it was set by the Army Engineers, once that had been done, the Coast and Geodetic Survey came in and positioned it. So we had a very high accuracy set of coordinates for this point. Well, in looking for it, first thing we had to do is we had to get permission from the National Park Service. I had been down here and I had wandered all around this area, and I found nothing. It was just all this nice grass that you see here now. Well, in talking to the National Park Service office here, they gave us permission to come out here and kind of dig around if we had to, but they assured us, the gentleman I talked to at the time assured us, no, we've done a lot of modifications out on the ellipse and whatever was there is gone. So, well, give us a shot. And so what I did is, a little bit later when we finish this, we're going to take a walk up to another mark called the 0 milestone. Well, that point, which is on the north side of the ellipse, also has a very accurate position in the National Spatial Reference System. So since I had a position for the 0 milestone, I had a position for this, and I had a position for the Washington Monument, it was a fairly easy computation to say, well, if I put a theodolite on the 0 milestone, backsite the Washington Monument, turn a computed angle between these coordinates, and go the appropriate distance, with some luck, we might find what we're looking for. So I did the computations, came down here on a Sunday morning, it was nice and quiet, no tourists or anything around. We did have a park ranger with us to make sure we were doing all the right stuff. And so I had my colleagues set up on the 0 milestone, backsite the Washington Monument. I gave him the direction, the angle to turn, which he did, and he gave me a range pole. And then he was computing my distance all along this line. I'm walking along, he's telling me left, right, as you normally would do in any survey. And when I got to an appropriate distance, he shouted out to me, "You're a 1/10 long." 1/10 of a foot too far. So I'm standing just on the other side of this mark now, and I had a probe with me, and I stuck it in the ground, and within about 1.5 inches, I heard it clink off the top of this stone. And it's one of those moments when you haven't seen anything in 100 years and you're a surveyor and you found it. It just kind of ripples through your whole body. Well, I got down on my hands and knees. I had my knife with me, and I cut out a chunk of the sod and I rolled it back, and sure enough, there was this stone. The look on the face of the park ranger that we had was just incredible. He was like, "How did you guys do that? How did you find it? It's just, you know, you're just sticking something in the ground." He thought of it as random. And I said, no. We have very, very specific knowledge of where things should be. And it worked out because all of these monuments were positioned very, very precisely. And more importantly, we had the metadata that told us how good it really was. So when I performed that computation, I could tell what the logical uncertainty was when we came looking for it. So I think it's a great, first of all, it's a great example of a historic monument. It's also a good example of how we can utilize values like high accuracy coordinates across the multitude of things that surveyors do, as long as we have the appropriate metadata that is associated. So again, this is in the National Spatial Reference System. If you go to the NGS website and you want to find this mark, you want to find the data on it, you simply type in meridian, and data will come up for this particular mark. It is now quite open, as you see here. It's not buried under anything, so you don't have to go digging for it. We're kind of hoping the Park Service will put some nice little wall around it, but that hasn't happened yet. So here we are in front of the National Park Service's Survey Lodge. And again, I want to give a shout out, a thanks to the National Park Service for all of their help on this particular project, and certainly with all the effort that they've extended to the National Society of Professional Surveyors in completion of the annual student survey competition. They've been absolutely marvelous. So what I'd like to talk about now is the last survey monument on this particular trip, and that is the Zero Milestone. Now, so you can see it's a fairly large pillar. It was established, it was set in 1924 to commemorate the location of the starting point of two trips made by the Army Transportation Corps in their effort to drive across the entire country. And quite a number of cities had zero milestones. Ostensibly, they were to be a point from which all measurements to the city were defined. That's kind of fallen out of favor, although I do believe here in Washington it still serves that function, that it's the centroid, if you will, of mileages to the city that you might often see on placards or something, certainly not something you would see online. So the monument itself, while it was not set as a survey mark per se, nonetheless, subsequent to it being established, and it was established in that meridian of the White House, very, very close to it. So to me, it's quite marvelous that we now have these 3 survey monuments, actually 4 if you want to include the Jefferson Memorial, that are all aligned in that original meridian that Thomas Jefferson had asked Isaac Briggs to determine. I personally think that's pretty cool. It's a great way to look at this portion of the city. So the Zero Milestone is part of that National Spatial Reference System. You can find it in the NGS database by simply typing in Zero Milestone. If you look by the name of the station, and its data sheet will pop up. It has horizontal coordinates. It's also a high accuracy benchmark. And it has served as a primary point for quite a number of applications. We had an occasion in 2011 when there had been a small earthquake in Northern Virginia, and it shook the Washington Monument, actually caused a crack up at the top of the Washington Monument. So the Park Service contacted the National Geodetic Survey to come down and perform whatever measurements we could to see if something had happened at the monument. They could see the crack, obviously, but they were very concerned about the base, and was anything moving that would not be anticipated. So we came down and we performed leveling observations, very high accuracy, first order leveling observations, and that marked the 0 milestone, formed as part of that survey as one of the final stations from which we could do the appropriate checks that were necessary. So it was great to have all of that wonderful control within a fairly short distance of the area that we had to survey. It's a great place to visit. A lot of tourists come here. They like to take pictures of the White House from this monument. Previously, when I had mentioned when we were up at the Washington Monument, and I had mentioned the Coast and Geodetic Survey performing a line of high accuracy first order levels in 1884, coming up from the C&O Canal, a brief distance from here. They did establish a mark at the Washington Monument, but then they continued on up to the Capitol, which is not very far, and they set a very special benchmark in a windowsill on the Senate side. And again, you can find that mark in the NGS database, Capitol benchmark. And it's easy to spot, but if you go there, it's always a good idea that before you walk over to it, again, it's in a windowsill up on the Senate side, up under the walkway, the long walkway that goes into the Senate side. If you do decide to go do that on your own, if you see a Capitol policeman, always a very good idea to stop, say hello, and tell them what you're looking for. They're very accommodating as long as you're pretty nice about the whole thing. I want to thank the folks from GeoLearn for their amazing support and help in putting this whole thing together. We could not have done that without their support. So thank you very much. If you're looking for information, good education on surveying, please go to GeoLearn. You'll find a tremendous array of surveying applications there that can easily fit your budget as well as help you in your various surveying applications. Other than that, thank you very much for your time, and we'll see you on the mall.